So here's the thing about consultants. They want to sell to strangers, but they don't want to sell to strangers. What I mean by that is most consultants ultimately hit a wall where their warm network has tapped out on them effectively. That's happening more and more now, by the way. And they realize that their warm network, the people that already know, like, and trust them, cannot sustain the business any longer. Either whether or not they're trying to stay where they are and maintain a certain revenue level, often the warm network cannot sustain that forever, maybe a few years, but likely not forever, usually not forever. And certainly if they're trying to grow, they often get to this point where they realize, well, I can't just grow on the back of the relationships I have. Those are fixed, and they're not growing fast enough to grow the business. So they know they got to go to the cold market, what we call the cold market. In other words, strangers, people that don't already know you, like you, trust you. They don't know who you are yet. But they struggle to do that effectively because they're used to selling to people that already trust them, and that's a lot easier, and they can be sloppier with their messaging and positioning. And there's the rub. You've got to sell at the cold market. You don't know how to. You haven't done it before. In many cases, you don't even want to go through the effort, even though it's necessary.
Yeah, and I would say, not wanting to is one thing. I think there's a real, inherent fear in it that it's worth calling out. Because to your point, if you've been working with people who know you and who, for whom your reputation precedes you, you walk in with a certain kind of confidence, right? There's no concern that these people are going to think that you're not capable. There's no concern that they're going to think that you're some kind of charlatan. You're coming with some built-in confidence that helps carry you through the conversations that you're going to have. So to your point, it can help you be sloppier, but it also, I think, just puts you in a place where you're comfortable. And what we're talking about is getting out of a comfort zone, going to a place where you need to talk to people who don't know anything about you, who are starting, excuse me, who are starting at best from a neutral opinion of you. And, at worst from an opinion or from a space where they think that maybe you're not quite everything you say you are. And it feels like there's a lot of, quote unquote, convincing to do. And that's an uncomfortable place to be.
Neutral at best, I think, is accurately stated. I think most prospective clients view consultants by default with a high degree of skepticism. Oh, another consultant. Oh, yeah, they're all the same. They all make these big claims and big promises. They all fail to deliver. A consultant is somebody who borrows your watch to tell you the time and then keeps the watch, right? So there's all these, reputational challenges that consultants face. Even though you might not be one of them, the label comes with quite a bit of baggage, right? And it's funny, while you were talking, I was thinking about my 14-year-old daughter entering grade 9 and going to a new high school where she has 2 or 3 friends that she's coming into the school with. And guess who she's spending most of her time with? She's attached to those 2 or 3 friends. And it's hey, go and meet new people and make new friends. And then she is slowly, but it's very similar, right? There's this comfort level with the people that I know. They already like me. They already trust me. We have rapport. And there's this fear of going out into the unknown and meeting new people. And every consultant, every business professional should understand this because they've experienced it probably in childhood in a similar scenario. And now it's really no different. I think the question that you ought to ask yourself, and this is the question I pose to my daughter, is maybe there's some people out there, some relationships that are better for you. Nothing's wrong with her friends, right? But it's a big world out there. Now you're in a bigger school. Maybe there's something even more interesting out there. Maybe you can expand the scope of your relationships, have more friends. My message to her, totally off topic, is you want to be able to walk into the cafeteria and be able to sit with any group of people and have lunch and just be friends and be able to socialize. And so I think that's kind of my question here to consultants is, I understand the security and the warmth of your warm market, right? It's easier. But how do you know there isn't something better out there for you and your business?
Well, and you can maybe get away with it in high school, right? You may end up eating in the stairwell or something if you limit yourself too much, but you can probably make it through high school. I think the important thing to recognize is that you are not going to be able to make it through business, right? You're not going to be able to maintain a successful, financially successful business without going outside of just the folks you know. At some point, it's going to catch up to you. And so it would behoove everyone to figure out early on how they're going to do that. And the good news is that there are strategies, right? There are very specific paths that you can take to connect yourselves with and endear yourself to these folks who don't know you right now. And if you can treat it as, a scientific exercise, right? If you can treat it as something that is methodical, if you can treat it as something that has specific steps that you go through, then it also starts to feel a lot less scary, right? Understanding that it's going to be challenging. And yes, you're going to go out there, and some of those people out in the big wide world, just like in the high school cafeteria, are going to not be interested and, not want to talk to you and not let you sit at their table. But if, in that cafeteria, you're going to find your people. And so it's really important to put in place, as I said, sort of early on and methodically, your path to doing that.
So let's give you a framework.
Yes.
Okay. And a little bit of context here on where this framework comes from. Believe it or not, consultants having to go out and sell to strangers is not the first time anybody ever had to sell to strangers. In fact, this notion of relationship business is very unique to consulting. Most businesses acquire customers with no pre-existing relationship. That's normal in business, not in consulting, but think about the software that you use. I've recently re-engaged Trello. I used to use Trello a lot, right? Now I use Trello again. I don't know anybody at the company. I just found it, and there's a process that we'll talk about today, and I started using it ultimately. Think about the dry cleaner you go to or the pizza store. I mean, you may have built a relationship, don't get me wrong, but you don't have a pre-existing relationship with the vendor. That's a very consulting phenomenon. And so marketers and business people, entrepreneurs have been coming up with frameworks and strategies and ways to engage strangers for really, really long time. In fact, the framework I'm going to share with you today can be traced back to 1898. 1898, back when I imagine print was the primary method of advertising and marketing communication, so newspapers and magazines. This framework was then applied to radio, was then applied to television, and ultimately was applied into digital marketing, and is still applied in all those platforms to date, right? It's a very simple framework, it's foundational, and you'll see how it can be applied to different applications. It's called AIDA. AIDA. Attention, interest, desire, action. It is one of the oldest, most commonly used marketing persuasion frameworks that we know of, and for good reason, because it does a really good job of encapsulating the persuasion process, starting with no relationship, no background, no, I don't know you, you don't know me. I don't want to get you to buy something, ultimately. Attention, interest, desire, action. Those are the 4 stages a customer, client, prospect, stranger has to go through to become a customer or a client. Should we jump in?
Jump in.
Okay. So attention is the first one. And right away, I think that's kind of revelatory, right? Because on the one hand, it's obvious. Like, if they don't know who you are, they can't buy from you. But how many consultants think about the objective of their marketing being to first and foremost get attention? Lots of folks want to win deals. Lots of folks want to generate revenue. Lots of folks want to book meetings. And that's, one of the key issues with I want to go out and book some meetings strategy is you cannot book meetings with people whose attention you don't have, or interest or desire, but we're going to get there, right? And so this has become more and more challenging, let's be candid, because now there is an abundance of supply of consultants in the marketplace. Every consulting market that we are seeing has a ton of supply, an oversupply of consultants, far exceeding demand for consultants. And so what's happening now is the battle is not the battle for the transaction or the battle for the deal. The battle is a battle for attention. Who can win the attention of the prospect? Who can win the mind share of the prospect? And so this is the first thing. We've got to get attention. Now, in terms of logistically, tactically, LinkedIn is a great place to do this, certainly where we focus with our clients, both in terms of outreach and content and being provocative in your messaging. We're not going to get too far into the tactical weeds here today, but suffice to say that the first thing that you've got to do is grab someone's attention in an age where attention is the most expensive commodity, right? I mean, attention is scarce, hard to come by, and for the average person, spread in far too many directions.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think it's also important to recognize you're looking for attention in general. You're not looking for their attention just in the context of, the problem they have or whatever it is they're trying to solve. And so you're fighting broadly in a world where people are being pummeled by not just, other consultants. That's not who you're necessarily fighting against in this particular step of the framework. You're fighting against just getting people to pay attention at all. And what that means is you need to be good, right? You need to be compelling because you're competing with the cat videos. You're competing with, other things outside of just, what's happening within the very specific confines of the business that you work in.
Yeah. You are competing against your competition, absolutely. But to your point, Karie, more than that, you're competing against the unread messages on my phone, the far too many WhatsApp groups that I'm in, the endless stream of content on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, the overwhelming email inbox of mine where people are waiting for replies and that's stressing me out. Slack notifications, my family, my health, like all these things that are competing for our attention is what you are trying to grab a slice of. And I think it's probably worth noting here, at least briefly, so we can move on to the other stages. Clients and prospects don't give much attention to small, inconsequential problems. And when I say clients and prospects, like they're a special breed of people, they're not. They have the same gray matter and hardware, between their ears as we all do. And that's true for all of us. We don't pay attention to small, inconsequential problems. We all have small, inconsequential problems that exist in our lives that we don't solve for because we give the lion's share of our attention and mind space and energy to the big, expensive, consequential, existential problems. And so there's an important lesson here around in your messaging, in your positioning. We cover this quite a bit in the power positioning workshop. You got to be really clear about the problem that you solve. And that problem better be a big, expensive, consequential problem. Otherwise, you have no hope of getting anyone's attention. In other words, don't tell me I can save pennies on the dollar. Tell me I'll get rich, just for a simple example. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense.
So now you have my attention. And practically what this looks like is, maybe I'm on LinkedIn and then I find you, I discover you, and your material kind of resonates and I'm now paying attention to you. You're somebody who I've taken an interest in. And that brings us to the second stage, is interest. Interest is about turning awareness, attention into curiosity. Interest is where I start to lean in a little bit more and try to understand more about who you are, what you have to say, and really assess, in a sense, whether you're somebody I should be paying closer attention to, whether you're somebody that has a perspective that I should be adopting or entertaining or negotiating among the perspectives I'm already looking at. And remember that chances are you're not the only person they pay attention to within the scope of what you do. Right. So we're obviously in marketing, business development. That's our vertical, if you will, or horizontal, perhaps. I'm guessing if you're listening to this, we're not the only voice, right? You listen to other folks when it comes to marketing and business development and consulting and so on and so forth. And you're now entering this jungle of ideas in your prospect's mind. You're not the only source of ideas. There's a whole bunch of other ideas, and they're trying to essentially negotiate: is this a perspective? Is this an idea? Is this a person that I want to let into my little ecosystem of ideas here that I use to help myself do my job and solve problems? That's the question on their minds.
Yeah, and to shift from this, awareness to curiosity, I encourage you to think about what does that for you, right? Because there often seems to be a disconnect between, I know what catches my attention, right? I get that. I know where my attention is drawn. I know where I kind of point to. I know where I spend or waste my time when it comes to, watching or paying attention to things out there. But there's often a disconnect when people go to do this outreach, right? Like to create the content or whatever it is that they're doing, reaching out to people. And it suddenly becomes very bland, and it suddenly becomes, something that just doesn't capture attention. And so there's something here about making sure that you are not just saying the same thing as everybody else, right? Because what you want to say is the thing that really piques someone's curiosity. What's the question you can ask? What's the thing you can say that's different, that draws their attention to you specifically?
Yeah, 100%. It's really important to understand how the brain does this as well. If the ideas that you are discussing or presenting are ideas that the prospect or the customer is already familiar with, what happens is this phenomenon called mental opt-out, right? They go, I've heard that before. I already have a file for that in my brain, so I don't really need to hear this again. I'll give you a good example. Recently, I was re-listening to an audiobook by Jim Rohn. It's called The Ultimate Jim Rohn Library. Jim Rohn, if you're not familiar with him, is kind of old school self-help. Tony Robbins' former mentor, was a bigger name. I want to say like 60s, 70s, give or take. Okay. And some of his stuff I like. I like his articulation. And in this audiobook, one chapter, he starts talking about time management. And he presents this idea of doing a time audit, which something you've done, but you've actually had me do before, Karie, believe it or not. I don't know if you remember that, but where you write down, every 15, 30 minutes, write down what you're doing. You take a really detailed time audit of where you spend your time. And the idea, it's a solid idea, right? The idea is that as you write down where you're spending your time, you will come to realize exactly where time is being wasted, time is being lost, where you can be more efficient, and just heightening your awareness of this is a really useful exercise. And I agree. But as soon as he started talking about it in this chapter, I skipped to the next chapter. Why? I've already heard this before. I've done this exercise. I'm not disputing its merit. I don't need to hear it again. And so the same thing happens, to your point, Karie, when you're contributing ideas into the marketplace, but they're ideas that are common. They've already been discussed. Your prospects heard them before, and they go, oh, here's a Me Too consultant, right? Just parroting what other people are saying, trying to get attention, but not bringing anything new or original to the discussion. Opt out. Not interested.
Yeah. So the question is, now they're paying attention, right? They're curious. There's a next step. And I think often we get a little stuck here, right? Like we get excited by the people that are, clicking on our videos or, hitting like on our posts. And the reality is that's not enough. So let's move on to the next step.
So at this stage, I think what you have is you have a captive audience, attention, interest. You've gotten their attention. They're now interested in you and what you have to say and your opinions and your positions. But there's no action, which is the last piece. There's no action in the absence of desire. So something can be interesting and intellectually stimulating to me, but I never make a purchase. I never buy. I never engage in the process in the absence of desire. And so what you have to have in the mind of the prospect is a desire to achieve an outcome or a result that can be delivered through your work. And this is so important because I mean, it's kind of old news for us, right? But like, how often do we meet consultants who are really, really good, really smart, really good at what they do, and they get great results for their clients, but fail to actually articulate to the market what those outcomes and results look like? And the answer is all the time. We meet those people every single day, right? I think we've used this analogy or metaphor rather previously on the podcast. It's the idea of if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You've heard that before, obviously. Well, consultants see themselves as the hammer. They're the tool, right? That's their thing. They're really good at solving problems and whatnot. But what they don't realize is often clients don't want a hammer. They want a nail in the wall, or they want a painting hung on the wall, even further, right? And so you have to be, this is your job as the consultant, is you have to be clear to the market about the destination you can take them to, the outcome that you can get, the result you can get for them, the transformation that will take place when they work with you. Because if you're not clear about that, they won't assume. They won't just guess. They won't give you the benefit of the doubt. Oh, I'm sure this will be useful. No, they've got to know up front where you're taking them in order to meaningfully engage in any kind of a conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. And they need to know it in a way that appeals to them. And that may sound obvious, but, framing this in a way that they can see how it actually, what's in it for them, right? The old thing we're always aiming for, right, is helping people understand what's in it for them, I think is critical at this point, because it's one thing for someone to say, yeah, Ahmed looks like a perfectly capable, competent consultant who's doing a great thing. But, the difference between that and Ahmed looks like a consultant who can help me, two entirely different paths.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting if you think about look at fitness and weight loss influencers as an example, right? It's a totally different example, but there's some lessons there. They post these before and after pictures on Instagram, and it's like before the guy is flabby and overweight and clearly obese, and then after it's like 10 days later he's got a six-pack and he's completely shredded, right? And hopefully the more honest ones, it's not actually 10 days, it's something more reasonable. But there's a reason why they do that. The reason why they do that is because it's compelling to see the stark contrast between the before and the after. It's compelling. It gets our attention. And we wonder, well, how do they do that? How do they get there? Well, what did that process look like? And they create desire in the mind of their viewers. Oh, I want to look like that. Now, I don't want you to think as a consultant that that's beneath you. I'm not saying before and after pictures of your clients is a good idea. That's obviously not what I'm recommending here. But you do need to be able to articulate where your clients typically are before they work with you, the pain, the plight, the challenge, the frustration, and where they typically end up at the end of your work together, the outcome, the results, the benefits that they experience. And if you can't articulate that, you're gonna lose some business as a result.
Yeah, and we're going to slide ourselves into the final step here, but I think, even if you can do it, when you get to the place where you can do it, where you're doing it effectively, where people are wanting the thing that you have and they're starting to show that interest, now we move into the action step. And I think it's really important to recognize that your job is not done, right? Because it often feels like because now we're getting that attention and we're having those conversations that the rest will just fall into place. And what we want to talk about when it comes to the step of action is what's required to now bring this all home, right? What's required to get someone signing on the dotted line so that you're able to move forward and work with them.
Yeah. And we get this question a lot from clients, right? They say, well, there's a lot of good things happening. I'm getting interest, I'm getting attention, lots of good conversations. There's lots of, but no one's signed yet, right? Because there's a timeline there, and there's a process that every prospect has to go through, and that's their process. And look, there in every market there are buyers that buy quickly, clients that buy quickly. They exist, and you will find them with enough volume. And there are those who are a little bit slower, and there are those who are really, really slow, right? There's like a fast lane, slow lane, extremely slow lane. And so when it comes to action, right? So AIDA, attention, interest, desire, action. At this stage, the client, the prospect has concluded that at the very least, that the outcome that you deliver is something that they desire. I want that outcome. I want that result. Action is usually not signed on the dotted line right away. Action is, let's more deeply engage with this particular consultant and see if they're the right consultant to get me the result and outcome I'm looking for. Which, yes, is often a meeting. And often there are steps that precede the meeting. And so I mentioned earlier that a lot of folks struggle to get meetings because they haven't done the previous steps. And attention, interest, desire is part of that. But even within action, it's actually a really big deal for a stranger prospect to meet with you without any introduction or prior relationship, to just message a stranger on LinkedIn or respond to something on LinkedIn or wherever it may be and say, hey, let's have a meeting. It's a really big deal. And often there are preceding steps, such as they might subscribe to your newsletter. They might attend a workshop. For us, that's a big one, right? So we do powerpositioningworkshop.com. We have a workshop that's meant to kind of introduce us to the colder market. So if you don't know who we are, what we do, you come to the workshop, that gets attention. On the workshop, we build some interest and desire. If on the back of that you feel like having a meeting, then we'll have a meeting. But the workshop is very much the context for the meeting. This might be your LinkedIn content. This might be a newsletter. It can be any number of things, but often there's some material that's consumed. I say often, but I mean almost always. There's some material consumed in advance of a meeting in order to justify a meeting.
Yeah. And so now you've justified the meeting. I think it's also important to talk about what happens in the meeting. What is it that you're trying to accomplish in this conversation? And, what people are often trying to accomplish is immediately asking for the business, right? Immediately trying to make that deal. And if there's anything that we're telling you as we talk through this process, it's that you have to move at the pace of your buyer. You can help to influence it, certainly. And, all the things that we're talking about will help to influence the pace that buyer is able to move from, not knowing anything about you to wanting to work with you. But just because now you've got them on the phone also doesn't mean that it's a done deal. And so there's, as you've been working steadily all the way through this process, and this can take some time, right? This can take days, this can take weeks, this can sometimes take months. And that's why it's important to be doing this, all of this work on a regular basis. But, when you get to the end, you got to be careful about moving too fast, right? You got to be careful about scaring them away. You've got to be careful about appearing desperate, all of those things. And so it's important in that conversation as well to ensure that you are following their lead, right? You're understanding where they are. You get, if they're at the point, you really deeply understand if they're at the point where they're ready to have a conversation about doing work together, or if you're at a place where you still need to provide more context, provide more proof, provide more information to continue to build up that desire in them that's going to, ultimately get them to a place where they want to move forward and work with you.
So that's the framework, AIDA: attention, interest, desire, action. And I hope what you're taking away from this is that going to the cold market and going to strangers is not as simple as, let me send some LinkedIn messages and post some LinkedIn content and it'll rain leads and people will sign on the dotted line. There's a process of persuasion that has to take place, beginning with interest and then building desire. Beginning with attention, then building interest, building desire, leading them to action. And within each step, there's some phases potentially that a cold prospect needs to go through to warm themselves up to working with you. Yes, you can do this at scale, though, right? And that's important to understand. It's not like everybody has to be taken through this process one-on-one. When you build effective marketing systems, which is obviously what we teach people how to do inside 90-Day Pipeline, this can be done to a larger group of people, a larger audience at a level of scale, which makes it efficient.